Hi BookTube, welcome to another fiction review. Today's book, it's another reread for me, and it's also number 9 of 18 in my winning titles TBR list. Today we are reviewing The Cure for Death by Lightning by Gail Anderson-Dargatz, published in 1997. My paperback edition was 294 pages long. Now, this book is a little tricky to get hold of. There is no UK Kindle version, and I'm not sure, I wasn't able to find it in print in the United States. It is a Canadian author, Canadian book, so you can get it on Kindle in Canada for $15.99 and in print in Canada for $19.68. And you can get copies in Britain as well, but they're a little on the expensive side. I did find a fairly cheap one, £5.98, but that was just one copy. Now, the printing on this is a little on the smaller side. It's definitely not even 11 point, I'm not sure what you would call it. Some white space around the page, and definitely space between the beginnings and ends of chapters somehow. I didn't really notice that small typeface or lack of space myself, but I think that was probably due to my personal emotional engagement with the book, which has something to do with the type of story it is. It is a homesteading story. I've said a la Willa Cather, but it's a more modern author, and it's set in Canada during the Second World War, so it's much later in time than Willa Cather's stories are set. But think of it like that, and think of it also to some degree as a coming-of-age story in that setting. As I've said, it's a homesteading story, so you have to think of the experience of people coming from Europe into the West. So they would have come as individuals or as families, and they come into land and territory probably very different from the kind of geography they'd come from, and they're coming into space that is already territory for different kinds of animals and also for the particular indigenous people who had been on the land for thousands of years before that. And of course, depending upon when you arrived, there might already be European settlers there from various parts of Europe, people who didn't necessarily speak the same language you did and didn't have the same cultural practices. And so every story about settlement in the West is a story about adjustment, about learning the climate, learning about the animals, learning about your neighbors and how to get along with them. There are inevitable mistakes. It's impossible not to make mistakes. And it's about those who manage in spite of those mistakes and those who don't. And I think what the novel stresses in the end is how crucial forgiveness becomes. It doesn't just become a nice thing to do for someone else. It really is almost essential in order to be able to go on in spite of everything. What do we know about the author? Gail Anderson-Dargatz was born in 1963, so just a year before me, and not far away either. She grew up in Kamloops, British Columbia. I grew up on the West Coast in Vancouver, and so what it's interesting about her coming from Kamloops is that is the general area in which she has set the novel. And so her own family history provides background and inspiration for this particular pioneering experience. She went to the University of Victoria and got her degree in creative writing. Well done. Wish I'd done that. And her first novel was published in 1994, was a set of short stories called the Miss Hereford Stories. And she's brought out a small number of novels, but all of them critically acclaimed. Her most recent being The Almost Widow, which was published in 2021. And of course, in the description box, there will be a link to her author website. Let's talk about what is in the structure. The setting is so important in this novel. This novel is set in Turtle Valley, British Columbia. Now, that is a narrow strip of lowland between mountain ranges in the Kootenays in southern British Columbia. And there's open land just enough where you can grow arable crops and you can graze sheep or cattle. And the Canadian Pacific Railway runs through those valleys. As you can imagine, it's one of the best places to put the track through. It stops at a number of towns, but it's the town of Chase that I think, maybe it's my best guess, is what the fictional town of Promise is based on. In terms of time, the story begins in 1941. So the Second World War across an ocean is happening. It seems so far away, and yet it is having some effect on the community. They're all good British subjects, so they are observing rationing rules, and they're blacking out their windows at night. I don't know why. I honestly don't know if they weren't sure how far German bombers could fly. It was before Pearl Harbor that it starts, so I don't think that they were worried about the Japanese. I don't honestly know. I think they were just doing it to be good little British citizens, but it does add a small element of humor, because the real threat, the real conflict going on in Turtle Valley isn't the Second World War. It is amongst the townspeople themselves. It is between the land and its European settlers, because the land can be an astoundingly violent enemy. There are storms that can suddenly, within minutes, wipe out whole crops in the fields. And there's also coyote and wolves and cougars and grizzly bears in the surrounding mountains. And when food is scarce for them, they come down into the valley at the fringes of farmland, looking to get a meal from the livestock animals. And then there's also this ugly, predatory state of mind. It's illustrated like the spirit of coyote, and it seems to move through individuals in the community. The Secwepemc, the First Nations people who are indigenous to that area, they are the ones who associate this state of mind with coyote, the trickster, as an antisocial spirit that can infect individuals and make them work against their communities. Coyote is associated with so much more in Secwepemc culture. He's called the Old One, and while he's known as a trickster and also the source of this crazy-making spirit, he's also a healer and a guide. Now, the novel isn't exploring those aspects of coyote directly, but if you think of the story's overall arc, it starts with some tension which builds and builds and builds and builds to an ultimate climax of violence. And then that seems to dissolve the tension, and there's a slow resolution toward the end of the book. And that seems to be very much in line with the other aspects of coyote as a guide and a healer. It's interesting that this all happens to a European family called the Weeks, even though they don't really believe in this spirit. The narrator of our story is Beth Weeks. She is the 16-year-old daughter in the Weeks family. She has an older brother, Dan, and lives with her mother and father on a small parcel of land that they've only recently purchased. Up until Beth was 14, her family lived a nomadic existence. They were shepherding sheep and living out of a big canvas tent, which they pitched at various places around Turtle Valley. And then a grizzly visits their camp one day to take advantage of a meal, an easy meal from one of the sheep. And that changes their father's mind, and he decides to settle down, to buy a piece of land, exchange his sheep for cattle, sow some flaxseed, and get on with being a farmer. Beth has also reached an age now where she's beginning to decide, who is she? What defines her? And the story covers just over a year, up until Beth's 17th birthday. There are a small number of characters because it's a very small community, maybe 8 dominant characters, of which 4, of course, are Beth Weeks' family, and another 4 are Secwepemc people, 2 hired hands who live and work on the farm, their grandmother Bertha, their cousin Nora, who live on their own land just a couple of miles away. And there are maybe another 9 less dominant characters who live in or around this fictional town called Promise. What I found to be the dominant thematic issue throughout the novel in many different ways was mobility and boundaries. Many characters are experiencing some kind of internal conflict or external conflict over the issues of mobility and boundaries, whether they should stay where they are in this very isolated, small community with its limited opportunities, or should they leave? How do they, if they stay, how do they establish and defend personal boundaries? Because sometimes in a small community, it's very hard to get privacy or to have secrets. Beth Weeks has started to menstruate, and so for her now, there's this whole new territory of sexual boundaries. How do you even lay them down? For a young girl, especially in that time when people didn't talk a great deal about those subjects, it's difficult to know what is right and wrong in certain particular situations. And who gets to decide? Who gets to answer those questions for her? There are young men who are always thinking about the fact that a few thousand miles away there is a war going on, and young men are needed for soldiers? Do they stay and help their families work on the farm? Do they deprive their families of much needed labor because they're needed overseas to serve the empire? All these changes. And Beth also has a problem with the change from a nomadic life to a stationary settled one. She is dealing with the process of deciding what kind of life is going to work for her. And within the Secwepemc community, there are individuals who attended residential schools. Now, these schools, Canadians will probably know this now because it's been in the mass media, they were often run by the Catholic Church, and their reputation has been blackened because it's been revealed just how much physical and psychological abuse was visited on the children in their care. They were punished, for example, for speaking their first language, among many other things. There will be links in my description box to articles about a residential school near Kamloops, where 3 years ago it was discovered that 215 bodies of children were disinterred. You can understand how disturbing that is. The novel isn't about the experience in the residential schools particularly, in case that's the kind of book that you were looking for. It does just show, though, the cultural conflict that is created by the attendees who, if they return to their communities, they're alienated because their internal sort of cultural boundaries have been shifted over to the European Christian model, and they suddenly find themselves at odds with their own relatives. The novel doesn't talk about any of the abuses experienced by characters who attended the school. Now, that could be for many reasons. I'm speculating it might be that in 1997, when Gail Anderson-Dargatz was researching the book, it wasn't widely known that the schools had conducted this kind of abusive treatment of children. And then there are also environmental boundaries that need to be negotiated. Turtle Valley isn't called Turtle Valley for nothing. It's named after the painted turtles, and these are a very widespread species of turtle. They're found throughout North America. Their habitat is fresh water, and so they can be found anywhere near a major river. In the novel, the female turtles migrate en masse to their nesting ground, and that takes them across the main dirt road that a lot of the farmers take to get into the town of Promise. And what's interesting is whether or not the turtles' natural behavior is respected, whether they are treated as creatures holding their own territory that needs to be respected, or whether they're just an obstacle to be driven through and driven over. That's a barometer of how much that antisocial spirit is building up in the community at any given time in the book. Problematic content. Well, there's a tremendous amount of problematic content in this book, and you have to expect it. Homesteading, whether it was in the 19th or early or mid-20th centuries in the West, it was an extraordinarily stressful thing to do. There's a book that's probably out of print now, but I would recommend it. It's by the author Barry Broadfoot, who was a journalist, and he tended to do his field work by going out and collecting the stories of ordinary people about different experiences. And his book, The Pioneer Years, focuses on the period of the highest immigration from Europe into the Canadian West, and just collects stories from everyday people. And there, when you read about the amount of hard work combined with isolation, and then the traumatic things, the fires, the hailstorms, encounters with large predators when you're underarmed, lightning, drought, accidental injuries and deaths, lack of medical knowledge, or any way to get treatment quickly. All these things, and that includes veterinary treatment for animals as well. It's incredible amounts of stress. And then you have to add on top of that the fact that, for the most part, right up until the mid-40s, there was no understanding about mental health issues, what caused it, how to treat it, how to deal with it. And so that environment created, yes, some very tough people on the one hand, but tough can mean two things. It can either mean the building up of a strength from deep inside as the result of suffering, or it can mean a very good-looking facade built up in front of a much more vulnerable personality. And that certainly is happening with some of the characters in this novel. The Cure for Death by Lightning, it's spotlighting one family and a small community, but I think they function as kind of a random sample of just how tough it can be for homesteaders. And the reader needs to be prepared to hear about and have and witness effectively scenes of abuse and cruelty directed at people and animals. But there is a counterpoint to all this stress. There are moments of joy in this book, and they all surround the recipes. And these come from a scrapbook that Beth Weeks' mother has compiled from whatever kinds of scraps of paper she can get her hands on, because it is the Second World War, so paper is scarce and difficult to buy where she is. So she even goes so far as to make her own paper from pulping various husks and grains from the crops that grow on the farm. The recipes are very simple home baking: cakes, pies, sweet buns, the kind of thing that a lot of people in Western North America will probably be familiar with, the kind of stuff that gets brought to picnics, to church suppers, or you make sure you have some available if a visitor is going to drop by for a cup of coffee, right? That kind of thing. And so they evoked for me very strong emotional memories of special occasions with my mother's extended family on their farms in Saskatchewan, where it seemed like every woman had her signature recipes and she could be called upon to produce those very short notice, and the bustle and the warmth and the fragrance of a big farm kitchen when it was baking day. I'd like to read you an extract from chapter 31, which illustrates how this joy can suddenly put itself even in the middle, in this case, of the worst moment in the book. All hell breaking loose, and I decided to make a cake. Honey cake, a pound cake, my mother's own recipe. I stole my mother's scrapbook from her rocking chair and left my sooty fingerprints on the page called Honey Cake, so, like it or not, I could never forget that night. Filthy Billy sat at the kitchen table, not scratching, not swearing, just watching as I spread the scrapbook out on the table in front of him, cleaned my hands, and made cake. Outside, over the trees that curtained the Swede's yard from view, fires of hell stormed up into the black. I knew it, but I didn't want to know it, so I made cake. Billy read out the ingredients slowly, painfully, as I collected them. 2 1/4 cups flour, 2 1/4 teaspoons baking powder, 1/4 teaspoon salt, 3/4 cup butter, 3/4 cup honey, 3 eggs, 3/4 teaspoon vanilla, 3/4 teaspoon lemon essence. I mixed the flour, baking powder, and salt together, and in a separate bowl, I creamed the butter and beat the honey, eggs, and vanilla into it before adding the dry ingredients a little at a time, so the mix was smooth. Then it was just a matter of stirring in the lemon flavoring. It was a nothing-to-it cake, as rich as sin, heavenly to a hungry, worried belly. I poured the batter into a greased loaf pan and set it in the oven. The fire in the kitchen stove had burned down from neglect, and I stoked it up some, but a slow oven is what a pound cake needs. And that is the review done. Please check out my description box. There is loads of stuff in there. There is the University of British Columbia 1908 map of the Kootenay region, so you can see the Canadian Pacific Railway moving through the mountains. There's a lot of articles about the Secwepemc people, including a lovely little video by one of the tribal elders, which will teach you how to say the name. I have had to practice a great deal in order to produce this video, but it was worth it. It was worth it. And also a little article about painted turtles, if you're interested in that. So lots of stuff to look into on there. Thank you so much for joining me again, everybody. Look forward to seeing you in a few days' time. Take care. Bye-bye.